about. And to look, normally we teach on the weekly Torah portion, but this time because it is Passover, we're entering into these spring feasts. I wanted to look at what is Passover. We've got a tendency that once we've been in the Hebrew roots for a little bit and we've celebrated these things, we think we know everything there is to know about it. And if we're not careful, they become mundane. We tell the story, we eat the meals, we do the Seder, and yet it doesn't really affect us here. We find that it becomes something that's solely a knowledge thing. It's all up here, and we understand it, and we know this is what it's about. It's all about redemption. These key words we throw around, and yet we go through each festival cycle, and we walk away, and we're unchanged. Same issues, the same problems. Our situation doesn't change. We come to the Passover table, and we talk about redemption, and we talk about change. We're talking about coming out of bondage, and we find the same shackles are still on us. We travel to Shavuot with the same shackles still on us. We arrive at Sukkot. Nothing's changed. But what about the change? We know enough now. We've been through this enough that now house, which the world when there's leaven in his own. And we find that this is exactly what Passover is about. He's inspecting the house. He's he did what he was supposed to do. So if he told that by his stripes we're healed, the reason we shouldn't be walking in these things is there. But surely it's not me. The enemy has caused these things in my life. The enemy has caused these things to come in. And yet Passover reminds us that no excuse is going to cut it. Passover reminds us that there's something that has to take place in here. This has to change. This vessel, this heart, this house must be inspected. And so as we begin to look at Passover, this is going to be the framework for what we're going to look at. If Passover is about redemption, if Passover is about coming out of bondage, Passover is about a change. Do you think the children of Israel, when they celebrated in Egypt, were they in the same circumstances they were before they had celebrated it? The difference wasn't there. They were no longer slaves. They were now free men. They were no longer weak and feeble and beaten down, but they were now made if we're willing to go through it. If we're willing to truly enter into Passover, to truly partake of this. And so as I began to look at this, the question missing. We're eating the Seder, we're eating the unleavened bread. We understand the idea of redemption, but what are we missing? Where's the disconnect? And as I begin to look, Exodus chapter 12 is where we see Yahweh speaking and the children of Israel, and he begins to instruct them about this season, about Passover, that they're to prepare themselves because the lamb's about to come into the house. And they're going to bring this lamb in, and this lamb's going to be slaughtered. And with that blood upon the doorpost, that's going to redeem them. They're going to come out. And yet as I began to look at this, it was interesting to me because before he ever begins to talk about the lamb, before he ever instructs them to bring this lamb into the house. This is the way he starts off this whole Passover scenario. In Exodus chapter 12, verse 2, he makes this statement. He says, "This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you." And after this statement, he explained that during this month, on the 10th, you're going to bring the lamb in. On the 14th, you're going to be passed over. But this statement is what begins it. And if you'll notice, even in the English, you can see he's repeating himself. This month shall be the beginning. It's the first month of the year. And if you look at it in the Hebrew, you'll find this statement, there's some words that are repeated. Well, do you realize that anytime Yahweh repeats himself, anytime he uses this again, it's to get our attention. There's something about this statement concerning Passover that we need to understand. He's beginning to lay the framework. He's beginning to build this foundation. So let's look in the Hebrew. This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. This is setting the stage for what these spring festivals are about. The word beginning in Hebrew, it's Strong's number 7218. It's the word Rosh. Can you say that with me? Rosh. It means the head, the beginning, the chief. It's where we get the term Bereshit from, Genesis, in the beginning. But the interesting thing about this word Rosh is that it's also connected with the concept of a census being taken, of a numbering of the people, a sum, a total of something. When we read this statement, not only could he be speaking to the children of Israel and telling them this is the beginning of the months, dealing with the calendar, but this same statement literally conveyed to them, this month is the month of numbering. This month is when a census is going to be taken. You're going to be counted. He's about to number his house, number his people. If we continue to look, we find that this term Rosh, there's another Hebrew word that's very similar, spelled exactly the same way. And we know that every single Hebrew word has both a blessed meaning and a cursed. It depends on what side of the covenant we're in. This word Rosh can mean gall, bitterness, venom, poisonous. It specifically is connected with turning away from Yahweh, from rebelling from the covenant, rebelling from having entertained the serpent. We understand as well that the Messiah made the statement, by your fruit, they'll know you. Well, do you realize Passover is an inspection of the fruit? Passover is a harvest festival. The fruit's being inspected. Branches, there's a census, a numbering that's taking place. He's counting the heads. He's counting those that are going to be part of the house. And we find that we're also being warned, be careful, because if you arrive at Passover and we're bearing the wrong fruit, if there's the wrong type of fruit on these branches, that it's going to expose us as having entertained someone else. In other words, instead of the lamb, we brought something else in. Instead of bringing the lamb into the house, we brought the serpent in. We brought another word, and we have he's coming. It's a time of and yet we're being warned that when he comes into his house, he's going to inspect this house. That if he comes into the house and he finds that there's someone else already there. There's something else already dwelling in the house. There's someone else already filling up this vessel. and the ordering of these months, it is to draw attention to the heads for those that are going to receive their bridal price, their dowry, the payments about to be paid to redeem the individuals that are counted. Isn't it interesting that Yeshua was executed, crucified outside of a place called the Mifkad Gate? It was the place of the census, the numbering, the place where the polls were taking. He was paying the we could again be counted. We could be given the price for our redemption. And yet we find that as he begins to take this count, as he begins to poll the house, not only is he counting the heads, those that are going to be redeemed, those that are going to be grafted back in because they're here, they're ready, but it also begins to expose those that have not, those that are bearing the bitter gall, having turned to other gods, swearing falsely, taking lightly these covenant oaths. If you were there last week, David made a statement about cups that we drink at the Seder. When we drink of these cups, when we eat this meal, it's a covenant meal. It's representing the fact that we're taking a covenant oath. We eat this meal with him, recognizing the fact that we're in covenant. We've just declared, just as Israel did, that all that you've said we will do. And yet we find we drink these cups, and as we drink these cups, they're either going to define us as a head that's been counted, one that came, one that made room for the Lamb, or it will expose some things in our hearts. It will expose us as one that took lightly our covenant oath, coming but not making room in the house. Do you think this may be why we're admonished to get rid of the leaven before participating? It seems as if we arrive at Passover, if we come to these festivals and we haven't taken the time to examine our own hearts, if we haven't taken the time to deal with these things, and when we arrive, we're bearing the evidence, we're bearing the fruit that we've spent time with another. We're showing that we flaunt it in his face. We come and we partake of these covenant oaths, and yet he looks and he inspects it and he sees time with another. How can we be set free? How can we be redeemed? How can we once again be made whole when we're constantly planting the very seed that keeps us in the bondage? It seems to me then, when we begin to look at Passover, we understand that he did his part. He accomplished what he set out to do, and we're reminded we can be redeemed, we can be set free, we can be made whole, but there's some things that we've allowed to be planted in our own hearts. There's some leaven that we let in. Do you realize nothing can happen unless allowed to plant this seed? As long as you're entertaining him, then no matter that it's Passover, you're allowing this seed to be planted, and everything in the kingdom's based on the law of sowing and reaping. If we want to be redeemed, if we want to be set free, if we want to be made whole, we've got to cut off these other things. We got to get the leaven out. Do you realize this is not the first time that this is actually being established here in Egypt? If we backtrack, we find that there was also another in-your-face, if you will, scenario, and it dealt with Abraham. Abraham is visited by 3 angelic visitors. They come to announce the birth of Isaac. It's the festival of Passover. In fact, they enter into a covenant meal. We see this. They're eating the unleavened bread. They're roasting the lamb, partaking of the Seder, if you will. And yet, in connection with this announcement of the birth of Isaac, the promised ones coming into the house, we find that there's also a numbering that takes place. There's a census. As these visitors get ready to leave, there's a conversation that takes place between Yahweh and Abraham, and it deals with Sodom and Gomorrah. In connection with the promised son arriving in the house of Abraham, there's also something else that's about to be dealt with. Realize the lamb can't come in unless room's made for him. Some other things are going to be cut off. Some other things are going to be dealt with. When Yeshua came into the temple in preparation for fulfilling the Passover feast, what does he do? He cleans his house. Some things are going to go. Some heads are going to get dealt with. We find that Abraham begins a census. There's a counting, a numbering that takes place. Sodom and Gomorrah. He asks if there can be 50 righteous that are found. If when the poll is taken, when the census happens, at least if there's 50, will you spare the city? And Yahweh makes a statement that yes, he will. And we find this conversation goes on all the way to Abraham gets down to 10. If I can find 10 righteous when I poll the city, when I number, when I count, if there's 10 righteous, will you not destroy it for the 10's sake? And he agrees. And we see this in Genesis 18:32. The sad thing is that obviously when this census, this poll was taken, we know what the outcome was, don't we? We find that not even 10 were found. The outcome of this numbering resulted in Sodom and Gomorrah receiving judgment because their fruit was one of gall. Their fruit was one of bitterness. Their fruit was one of the serpent. See, they had entertained the serpent. There was no room for the lamb in this house. And so when Passover came and it was the time for them to be redeemed, when there's no room made for the lamb, we find that they're cut off instead of redeemed. In Deuteronomy 32, verse 32, they're connected with this idea of the gall, the bitterness, the hemlock. It says, for their vine is of the vine of Sodom and the fields of Gomorrah. Their grapes of gall, rosh, this same word that we looked at earlier. Their clusters are bitter. Well, let's look a little bit closer at these names, Sodom and Gomorrah, because there's some clues in these names that reveal how in the past we could keep the Passover. We can think we've done it all, yet somehow we've stayed in bondage, haven't we? We've kept these feasts, and yet somehow we're not walking at the full capacity that we could be. And yet when we begin to inspect this, we understand that it's Yahweh's mercy because he wants us to be redeemed, doesn't he? He wants us to be walking, to be made whole, to be healthy, to be healed, delivered. And we find that he's beginning to reveal these things for just such a time as this because he's waiting for a group of individuals that would understand and once again come out of Egypt. Let's look at these names, Sodom and Gomorrah. What made them get cut off? What made their house receive judgment? What kept them from welcoming in the Lamb? The name Sodom. In Hebrew, it's Strong's number 5467, Sidam, and it means a burning. It's from an unused root meaning to scorch. And we can see, obviously, this name was prophetical because that's exactly what happens here, isn't it? It gets burned down. They're scorched. But there's some very powerful words when you begin to break down this name Sodom. Names are prophetical. The root on the end immediately jumps out, and most would be familiar with it. The Dalet Mem is on the end of the name Sodom. It's spelled Samek Dalet Mem. Dalet Mem forms the word Dam. Any of you know what that means? It means blood. What are we talking about? The Passover lamb, the blood applied to the doorpost, the blood applied to our hearts. But let's look at the first part of this word. The first part is spelled Samek Dalet. It forms a root in Hebrew, which means stocks for the feet, shackles. Isn't that what we've been talking about? Passover is about coming out, being redeemed, having the shackles removed. And yet this name Sodom indicates that this group of people, they were shackled. They were in bondage. Could it be that whatever perversions were taking place in these locations actually became the shackles, the stocks upon the feet that would hinder them from receiving the dam, that would hinder them from receiving the blood that would redeem and cover? It would hinder them from partaking in the Passover and being redeemed. When you begin to look at some of the things that were happening at Sodom and Gomorrah, we often point fingers. Well, at least we're not that bad. All kinds of perversions were taking place, but if you'll notice, these were all perversions that dealt with the flesh. And they were reaping 100-fold the flesh, the fruit of the flesh. We find that some of us, when we begin to inspect our own houses, we may not be at 100-fold rate yet, but we've been seeing the 30-fold, haven't we? We've been seeing some increase of this that we've been allowed to grow. We've been seeing some of this harvest. That's why we're dealing with some of the issues we're dealing with now, because we allowed it to be planted. We didn't cut it down. We didn't pull it up. We haven't fold rate yet, but we're at the 30. The next is 60. And if it continues to progress and we don't deal with these things, don't they know? The harvest gets bigger and bigger. And regardless of how big or little it is, bondage is still bondage, isn't it? A shackle is still a shackle. Whether or not we're dealing with some of the issues that they were dealing with, there are still things in our own lives that if we don't deal with it, they become a shackle that will keep us from truly entering in and experiencing Passover. Let's look at this name, Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah. In the Hebrew, this word is amorah. It means submersion, but it's interesting because on the end of this word, you can see that term, mora, bitterness, gall. Remember? The bitter, the gall, the roots, this vine of Sodom and Gomorrah. It comes from the root in Hebrew. It's Strong's number 6014, amar, and it means to bind sheaves, to gather, to manipulate something, to deal, to treat one as a slave. Well, notice that. What's Passover about? The slaves being set free, coming out. Mora keep you in bondage. They keep the shackles on the feet. They manipulate you. They treat you as a slave. They keep you in bondage. This term amar can also carry the idea of to heap up something. And it specifically can refer to the idea of heaping up stones. We don't understand it today in our Western mentality, but whenever they would heap up stones and make a pile of rocks, it was to ratify a covenant. A gesture that whatever these two parties had just agreed to, that they agreed to the covenant. They agreed to the terms. Here was the sign. It was a pillar. It was a monument. It was a mark. Well, that means that obviously Sodom and Gomorrah, the focus is on who have we been ratifying a covenant with. Because here it is. He's beginning to inspect what kind of monument have we erected? What kind of statute is in the house? Who is it showing? What covenant are we in? Whose oaths are we taking seriously? This word amorah, it's spelled with the ayin, mem, resh, hey. In the Hebrew, this letter ayin is a silent letter. So is the aleph. In fact, you'll find that the ayin and the aleph are interchangeable words. You can switch these two out and you'll find they're the same root stems in the Hebrew language. They're etymologically connected. If you exchange the ayin for the aleph, we get to the word imra. Imra means word, speech. Specifically, it refers to the word of Yahweh. It shares the same root. The aleph mem resh is the word for imar, which is translated as lamb. Could it be then that what has the potential to hinder us from partaking of the Passover, from actually receiving the blood covering that would redeem us, the very thing that would shackle would be the word or the seed, whatever we allowed to be put in leading up to it, and then in turn begin to speak out. This is what bound and enslaved. He's reminding you that your words are either going to indicate that you're in a covenant with the Lamb. When he comes into the house, he's either stones declaring that we're in covenant, that we've been keeping the word, that the Lamb is welcome in this house, or he's going to see the signs of one that's given false testimony, of one that's said the word, said the key phrases, but there was never a change in the house, in the heart. And we find that he's reminding us that it's our own words at Passover, the very thing that we put in and then that then comes out, that will determine whether we're enslaved or set free. Quite an indictment against us, isn't it? As we look at this, it might be in our best interest then to do like Isaiah did. Isaiah cried out to Yahweh and he proclaimed, "Cleanse my lips." Hineni, here I am. Change the words, change the seed, fruit that's being born in this house, and it's going to change your circumstances. He's done what he needed to do. The lamb's ready. He'll come in. He'll redeem you. He'll set you free. But if we're not willing to make room for the lamb, whose fault is it? If we're not willing to let go of these things, if we're not willing to cry out, change my heart, take the coal, cleanse me. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. I'm sick and tired of the bondage. I don't want to stay in Egypt. I don't want to serve. I'm ready to come out. Cleanse me, change me, burn up the dross within me, make me yours. Let's look at this word for grapes. In Deuteronomy 32:32, we're told that he connects this. It says, for their vine is of the vine of Sodom and of the fields of Gomorrah. Their grapes are grapes of gall. The word grapes here is inab. Psalms number 60:20, translated as meaning grapes. Yet it has a very interesting root stem in the Hebrew. It's spelled ayin nun bait. The nun bait in Hebrew specifically deals with the ability to speak, to prophesy, to proclaim. It's a reminder that and what we proclaim become the fruit by which we are known. He's reminding you that the words that are coming out of your mouth, they're powerful. To keep you enslaved, or they have the potential to set you free. This fruit, these words that come forth, need to change. It's interesting because this term inab, it has a numerical value of 122. It's the same value as the name Zilpah. You remember who Zilpah is? She was one of the wives of Jacob. Her name is translated as meaning a trickling. Something that's been stopped up. It's barely flowing out. Just a trickle is available. A lot of us in the house, we've had just a trickle of the word, just a trickle of what the potential is that we could have. Let's look at this name, Zilpah. Why is it so confined? Why is it now just a trickle instead of overabundantly flowing? Her name is Zion Lamed Pei Hey. The Zion Lamed is a root that means to neglect. It's connected to the Pei Hey, which forms the word pei, meaning mouth, speech, language. The meaning of her name could literally be translated as one who despised and neglected the speech, one who despised and neglected the language, the mouth. In other words, she neglected the language of her covenant oaths. She neglected the mouth of the one that was into her. She despised it. And because of that, instead of being overflowing, poured out and abundant, it became a trickle because she herself had cut it off. We find then that an indicator that we're bearing the same fruit as Sodom and Gomorrah is if we're one who despises the speech, if we're one who despises the language of our covenant oath. You see, it's the fruit that we're bearing. It's being born from what we've allowed to be put in. If we held this in high esteem, then we wouldn't have to worry come Passover, would we? There would not be a lot of leaven. If this is what we're bearing is good fruit, we'll be known by the good fruit. But if we've despised this, if we've neglected this, and it's only now, well, we're a vessel, we're going to hold something, that means someone else has come along to entertain us. That means someone else has come along to fill the void because of this. So something else is now in this vessel. And at Passover, as the fruit's being inspected, it begins to reveal what we put in, what we allowed in the house, what we allowed to remain, even when we were told, get the leaven out. Even when we were admonished, clean the house so the lamb can come in. We find that the fruit of our lips instead becomes likened unto bitter gall and hemlock. And it's this fruit that then shackles our feet and hinders us from experiencing the full redemption of Passover that we could have because we weren't willing to make room for it. Now, with this understanding of what's taking place, let's look specifically at this term Passover, the festival of Pesach. In Hebrew, it's translated as Passover, a sparing, immunity from penalty and calamity, a sacrifice offered on account of the sparing of the people. But we're down because there's a lot more than just you being spared. There's a lot that's contained in this word. It has a numerical 48. It just so happens 148 is the same value as the word in Hebrew, mozanim. It's Strong's number 3976. Balances. It's a reminder, what is Passover about? You're being weighed in the balance. You're being placed upon the scales, the fruit being measured, you're being inspected. Did you clean the house? Has room been made for the lamb? Can he fit? Or is there too much other stuff? It comes from the root azan, meaning to weigh, to test, to prove, to consider. But the interesting thing is that it's a cognate of the word azan, which means ear, to hear, to listen. We find that at Passover, we're being weighed in the balance upon the scales, and the test is specifically concerning what's our hearing like. What have we tuned our ears into? Who have we listened to? Ears are a gateway. What's been put in the vessel has come through these ears. Have we weighed it out? Have we tested it? Or has just all kinds of manner of junk been put in the vessel? Is the house clean or unclean? Is the house ready for the lamb or is it not ready for the lamb? The weighing, a balance, being measured, being tested. You may be thinking, wait, wasn't this specifically dealing with our mouth, the words that we're speaking? And now all of a sudden, now we got to worry about our hearing too? Well, that's just too much. And yet we find that when you begin to look in the natural, the interesting thing is that the majority of speech disorders, especially in children that don't speak correctly, they stutter, they stammer, they have a speech impediment, it's caused the majority of the time by a loss of hearing. Do you realize that we learn how to speak? We learn the sense of speech. We can't hear the voice of Yahweh. We then can't in turn speak it. And no change. The seed's not being spoken forth. There's nothing being planted because we can't hear it anyway, and we can't in turn speak it properly. And that Passover reminds us that we have to be able to Shema. Hear, O Israel, understand my words. Tune your ears into me. Balance what you're hearing with the Torah. Let this be your scales. Let this be your set of weights and measures. Weigh out what you hear because it's going to be evident by the words that come out of your mouth. The way we speak is an indicator of how well we hear. If we're unable to speak the Torah properly, it's because we haven't listened properly. It's because we haven't tuned our ears in, and it becomes something, our own words then become something that bind and enslave us. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 21, the statement is made, death and life are in the power of the tongue, and they that love it shall eat the fruit thereof. That's a very powerful statement. Remember, we're dealing with Passover. Israel's redeemed. They're brought out. They're made whole. They're no longer in bondage. They have life instead of death. Do you think it might have something to do with the fact that they began to declare what the word said into their own situations? They took what they were told, they were given the instructions, and they put it into practice. And miraculously, it actually worked. And yet we find here at Passover, the same thing is you're being given. We're reminded of the same thing. These are the instructions. Bring the lamb in, bring the word in, apply the blood to your doorpost. Begin to declare this into your own situation and see if it doesn't change things. Put him to the test. Do you realize we said earlier, Passover is a harvest festival? That means that whatever we planted prior to Passover is what we're reaping at Passover. That means all previously, the year before, we've been busy planting. We've been busy allowing seed in. We've been busy speaking seed forth. And come Passover, that harvest is what we're dealing with. So if we're still in bondage, if we're still in slavery, if we're still dealing with these issues, he's reminding us, look at what seed's been planted. Maybe someone else spoke it into your life. Maybe you allowed it. Inspect the seed, weigh it out. This can be dealt with now. He's ready. He's here. This is why we got to clean the house. Get the leaven out. We may have fruit that shouldn't be there, but he's giving us an opportunity. He gives you 4 days. The lamb's brought in on the 10th, and you don't have to slaughter him till the 14th. 4 days to make sure while that lamb's there, let's get this house ready. Let's get this house prepared. Let's make sure it's clean. Let's all of these other things that have tried to come in and keep us hindered, and let's go forth. If we break down this term Passover, we understand that every single Hebrew letter has its own definition. It's a picturesque language. Each one has a meaning that it's lending to this. So when we see this term Passover, not only does it mean to be passed over, to be spared, but we need to look at the individual letters, because these letters begin to define what the festival of Passover is about. The first letter, go figure, is the peh. It means the mouth, speech. But the peh can also represent a vessel. After all, we only speak what we've stored up in the vessel. From the heart, the mouth speaks. If there's something wrong with the way we're speaking, it means there's something wrong with what we've been putting in the vessel. It's an inspection of the vessel. The peh, the mouth, according to the rabbis, is seen as what brings reality into being. How was your world created? Yahweh spoke it into existence. Speech is powerful. Our own mouth, our own words as well have the same potential. We just read Proverbs 18:21. Death and life are in the power of the tongue. Whatever we speak forth affects our surroundings. What we speak forth becomes what's created around us. It affects the situation. But guess what? I found that not only does what I speak forth affect my situation, but it begins to affect everyone else around me, because you're in my level of influence. So now whatever I'm planting, whatever I'm doing, it now affects you in your life. And so with that understanding, if I don't care enough about my own house, if I don't care enough about myself to get these things out, then think of the people around you. Think of your children, think of your spouses, think of those, your friends, your family, those that you're affecting. It's affecting the whole community. It becomes a ripple effect, either for the good or for the bad. We find that, therefore, whatever we've stored up in this vessel seems to be what's going to determine whether we're passed over, whether we're redeemed, delivered, set free from bondage, or whether we stay in captivity, whether we stay in bondage in Egypt. What we're speaking for begins to affect whether we're going to have life or death. It begins to affect us of whether we're going to have healing and be made whole, or whether we're going to have these issues that are still hanging on, whether we're going to have peace or chaos. It begins to be affected by what we're speaking. The first letter of Passover reminds us, inspect the seed you're planting. Inspect what's in the vessel. This is what has the potential to change your situation. This is connected to the letter Samek. The letter Samek, the actual term Samek, it can infer the placing or the laying on of hands. This was referring to a ritualistic or a legal setting. Whenever the priests were ordained, they had the hands laid upon them. Samek. Whenever an offering was brought to be lifted up on your behalf, Samek, the hands were laid upon the animal. The sin was transferred. Remember, this is dealing with Passover. The lamb's coming into the house. The lamb is here. And he reminds you, first, inspect what you're planning. Make sure the house is ready, because this is going to affect the process, what's in this vessel. Second of all, he reminds us the lamb is now brought. Now all you have to do is Samek. Lay your hand on the lamb. He's there. He's ready. All of these things that we've allowed in, he can take this on. He'll allow you to be set free from your bondage. Remember, he's coming to pay the price. He's coming with the dowry. He's coming to buy you back. And we find that when we samek, when we lay our hands upon the lamb, we can go free and he pays the debt. But if this house wasn't made ready, What was the point? Because we'll find ourselves right back in the same situation next year. It's a cycle. If I continue to plant apple seeds, I'm going to continue to get an apple tree. I'm not going to get potatoes. I'm not going to get carrots. Why would I expect anything different? This is the law of nature. This is how it works. Plant the same seed. If I continue to act the same way and don't deal with myself, why should I expect a different outcome? Let's look at the letter ket. Well, actually, let's go back to that samek. It has a value of 60. 60 is the value of the Hebrew word kali, and this word means a vessel, an article, a receptacle. Once again, he's reminding you, the emphasis is on the fact that you're a kali, you're a vessel. What's in the vessel? Is the leaven still there, or have we removed it? Have we made room for the lamb, or are we content to hang on to our sin, our leaven, our bondage? Are we willing to let it go, to lay the hands to samek? The next letter is the Hebrew letter ket. It represents a fence, a wall. Now, a fence or a wall can either keep you in or it can keep you out. We find that at Passover, remember, we made the statement being drawn in the sand at Passover. A ket is being drawn upon the house. If you're in the house, great. It's going to keep you in a form of protection. It becomes something that will enclose you, guard you, keep you. But if you find yourself outside the house because you weren't numbered, you weren't counted, you didn't present yourself, then this ket, the very ket that could keep you in and protect you, now keeps you out. You're fenced out. You're not counted. You're cut off. The letter ket was the letter that was drawn upon the doorposts in Egypt with the lamb's blood. When you look at this letter ket, you'll find that it's constructed of the Zion and the Vav in the Hebrew. And they're bridged together. These two letters, a bridge connects them. Comes the picture of the king, the husband, the Zion, standing under the huppah, this bridge, this connection with his bride, the Vav. When we pull these definitions together, this is defining his intent at Passover. It conveys the idea that it's the words of our mouth, it's the oath, the covenant that we choose to make at this time, what we've chosen to store up in our vessel, our hearts, leading up to this divine appointment that then determines whether we stay enslaved and in bondage or whether we're set free. If we've taken the time to ensure that the words of our covenant are written upon our hearts, if it's not just a trickle for us, but if it's been flowing, if we've been putting it in, we haven't despised it or neglected it, we've given it the esteem that it deserved, then when the census is taken, when he inspects the house, when he begins to look and see what kind of fruit are you bearing, what's on those branches, then we find that we'll be one that's fit to stand under the huppah. We're one that's fit to stand beside the king. The dowry's given. The bridal price is paid. And we can enter into this time of intimacy. And it's a ride straight to the top from there. After this, we find that he begins to continue to prepare us. He cleans us. He prepares us for Shavuot. It's a continual process. But if we don't get it right at Passover, how can we get it right at Shavuot? Get it right at Shavuot, how can we get it right at the Feast of Trumpets? We can't hear properly, remember? If we can't get it right at the Feast of Trumpets, then what are we doing at the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur? We missed the covering at Passover. How about now? And finally, we find ourselves at the Festival of Sukkot. You see, it's a ripple effect. It's a cycle. Passover kicks this thing off. We can't afford to get it wrong at Passover. It's time to make a change. This word Pesach, Passover, it comes from the root Pesach, which means to pass over, to spring, to skip. But it can also mean to limp, to be lame, to be wrenched or dislocated, to halt. It's the same root of a word Pesach, which means lame, crippled. It denotes a person who has a physical defect, an injured leg or foot that would hinder a person's walking ability. You realize that some of us have been in chains for so long that once they're taken off, we don't know how to walk properly. We walk with the defect in our walking. Well, this same defect is the same word that's used to describe something that would disqualify a person from the priesthood. something that would disqualify an animal for sacrifice. This is quite interesting because it's at Passover. He's reminding us there needs to be a change in our identity. This has got to take place. We've got to break this mindset that we've had before, that we're in bondage. It's hindering our walk. We're not able to walk uprightly. At Passover, we're reminded that it's time that we become Israel, Yashar El, those that would stand upright, those that would be able to walk unhindered, those that would not, because it's the very ones that are at Passover that were later supposed to be the priests. In Exodus chapter 13, he begins to he spared their firstborn. That firstborn now belongs to him. The firstborn was supposed to be the priest of the house. Sanctify unto me all the firstborn. Whatsoever openeth the womb among the children of Israel, both of man and of beast, it is mine. We find that Israel messed this up, didn't they? Firstborn neglected their duties, and it went to Levi. Levi stood up and said, we'll serve you. We'll be the priests. Every Passover, though, once again, we're being passed over. Every Passover, we've got an opportunity. Once again, will you be the priests? But the priests can't stumble. They can't walk with the defect. That's going to disqualify us. We've got to be one that's walking uprightly, one that's able to walk this thing out. And if we'll do that, and we've been passed over, then we have the potential. Then you and I, we can be a kingdom of priests. So we find then, could this be a warning that depending on how we represent ourselves, we come to the Passover, it seems as if there's the potential for us to disqualify ourselves. It seems as if there's the potential for us to not make the cut to be a kingdom of priests. We find that at Passover, we're reminded of the importance of our covenant, and if we've taken this oath lightly, everything that we put importance upon, that we're actually disqualifying ourselves to function in this role. We find that this same concept was conveyed by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 28 through 30, the statement is made, but let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of bread and drink of that cup. For he that eateth and drinketh unworthily eateth and drinketh damnation to himself, not discerning the body. For this cause many among you sleep. He's talking about the Passover. But notice what he says, let the man examine himself. Yahweh's going to examine the house as well. The Messiah, before the Lamb comes in, he's going to inspect the house, but you come examine yourself. Do the self-reflection that says, if you come and you partake of a covenant meal, instead of being set your station, there's a change that's taking. You really wouldn't normally connect with Passover. It shows up in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 21. And it's describing how the nation of Israel, they halted, Pesach. They fluctuated between two opinions from one to the other. They were riding the fence. What does that sound like? 1 foot in Egypt and 1 foot in the promised land, riding the fence. Not willing to leave this one completely, but not wanting to miss out on this one. Back and forth, Pesach, fluctuating, halting, messing up our walk. We're stumbling, we're falling because we're too busy trying to spread out and keep 1 foot in each place. In 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 21, it says, and Elijah came into all the people and said, how long halt? How long Pesach ye between two opinions? If Yahweh be God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him. And Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And yet this word Pesach, the root of Passover, is right here. This is a Passover encounter. Passover is all about this confrontation. Who are you going to serve? And I got news for you. You better have an answer. Are we going to continue to serve Baal? Are we going to continue to serve Pharaoh, to be in bondage, to allow the leaven to dictate to our lives and in our houses? Or are we going to serve Yahweh and get it out? Are we going to serve Yahweh and bring the lamb in and do what he's called us to do, knowing good and well that when I bring this lamb in, if I've done everything I'm supposed to do, it's now on him and he's going to do his part. If I need healing in my body and I've done everything I can to get the leaven out, when I bring this lamb in, I know without a shadow of doubt that by his stripes I'm healed. When I bring this lamb in, if I've had chaos and everything's falling apart around me, if I've done my part, when I bring the lamb in, there will be peace in my home. There will be Sar Shalom reigning. Now let's continue to look at this. Elijah's encounter's taking place at Mount Carmel. That's something that we would just, okay, well, it's a location. No meaning there. But look at it. It's translated as meaning a garden land. It's from the root meaning plantation, an orchard, a garden. And this is a reem, which means a vineyard. What grows in a vineyard? It's where the grapes are grown. Well, isn't that funny? Earlier we looked at Sodom and Gomorrah, the grapes of gall, the grapes of Rosh, bitterness, hemlock, gall. And here we find this connection again. This is taking place at Mount Carmel, the vineyard, the fruits being inspected. Is it the grapes of gall of Sodom and Gomorrah? Is that the vine that's here, or is it something else? We find that this is the same confrontation that Passover is dealing with. All of Israel was about to be exposed as either being in covenant with the Lamb or being one who had entertained the serpent, being one that had brought Baal in, being one that would produce the grapes of gall. Their fruit was about to expose them at this encounter. The interesting thing is that this term Carmel has a numerical value of 290. It's the same value as the word peri in Hebrew, which means fruit. He was inspecting the fruit. But it's also the same value as another Hebrew word, the term erek, which means an estimate, evaluation, things that are set in order. This word is used in Leviticus when he's describing a census that would take place depending on what they were worth. A numbering, a value was being placed on them, erek. So we find that their value are set on the people of Israel for this census, depending, it seems, upon the fruit that they were producing. We find that whether they're grafted in or cut off is going to depend upon what their fruit showed at this Passover encounter. Had they brought Baal in or had they brought the lamb in? Let's look at this word came. It says Elijah came unto all the people and asked them this question. The word came is nagash, and it means to draw near, to approach, but it doesn't just mean to walk up to someone in a casual manner. It deals with the concept of drawing near. This was a very important encounter. Elijah was coming. He knew what time it was. It's Passover. He understood the consequence. He's about to come into the house, and he's coming for a divine appointment. He's coming to be intimate with his bride. We may not want to have all these vestiges of the other ones that we've been entertaining in the house. It's the same term that was used in Genesis 18:23 when Abraham draws near to Yahweh concerning the counting and the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. Same word. But the interesting thing is that it's a cognate of the Hebrew word nagas, spelled the exact same way. The only difference is the points on the sheen. And this word means to oppress, to exert, demanding pressure, to impel, to urge. It's the word used to describe the taskmasters of Egypt. Could it be then that the choice that's being presented to them and to each of us at Passover deals specifically with whether or not we're willing to draw near, to nagash, to Yahweh, to be intimate with him? And if we're not, if we refuse, then it seems as if we're left to the taskmasters. We're left in bondage. In other words, every single Passover, if we fail to draw near, if we fail to enter into this intimate appointment with our king and our husband, and then after this we're still in bondage, it's because we failed to do that, and now we've been left to the taskmasters. We've been left in the bondage. This is why Passover happens every year. Hopefully, through one of these cycles, we'll get it. Hopefully, at one point, we get to the point like the children of Israel did where we'll cry out because of this cruel bondage and we'll ask for the Redeemer. We'll ask to be brought out to be redeemed. Let's look at the word opinions. How long will you halt between two opinions? It's the word saif in Hebrew, and it means ambivalence, division, a divided opinion. And some of us maybe think, well, that's not so bad because we're two-minded anyway, unstable in our ways. It can be that bad to not be able to decide, to not make a stand. Surely, just laying low usually works pretty well for us. I don't offend anybody. I can have both opinions. No one cares. No one knows. I just don't rock the boat. Don't get the enemy mad. Don't get these other people mad because they might say something. I might have to deal with them. Well, let's look at how important two opinions is to Yahweh. This word comes from the root sa'af, and it means to cut off, to lop off boughs, to cut off branches. Quite interesting because this is dealing with us riding the fence, and we find that the root of this word reminds us that there's some very serious consequences when we ride the fence. 1 foot in Egypt and 1 foot in the land. It can cause us to be cut off. Branches that are cut down. John chapter 15, verse 6, the Messiah makes a statement, if a man abides not in me, he is cast forth as a branch and is withered, and men gather them and cast them into the fire, and they are burned. What happened at Sodom and Gomorrah? The branches were cut off and they were burned. There's other statements in the New Testament that reminds us that if we don't bear good fruit, that's a tree that's going to be cut down and that tree's going to be burned. Don't halt between two opinions. I'd rather you be hot or you be cold, but because you're lukewarm, I'm going to spew you out of my mouth. Perhaps then this is why every year in the Seder meal, there's the cup of Elijah. The interesting thing is that no one drinks this cup. It's poured and it's left. And we understand that it's a reminder that before the coming of the king, the spirit of Elijah will come. The anointing, the calling, the prophetical role of Elijah will come to usher in the presence of the king. But yet, could this cup every year be a reminder as well that if we continue to ride the fence, if we continue to halt between two opinions, that we have the potential of being cut off? The cup that sits on the table reminds us of the same question that Elijah gave to Israel. How long will you halt between two opinions? If Baal is God, serve him. If Yahweh is, then let's serve him. Passover is a line drawn in the sand. This name Elijah, because if the anointing of Elijah is going to be coming before the king, and we understand that it's going to be, we should be functioning as the spirit of Elijah, making way for the king. Let's look at who Elijah was. His name is translated is Yahweh. There's no doubt of what his opinion was. There was no riding the fence. The declaration was loud and clear. This is who I serve. The numerical value of his name equals 46, which is a quite interesting number because 46 is the number of chromosomes that organizes our DNA. Could it be here that this connection to Elijah is that when Yahweh promises to send Elijah in the final days, it was about restoring the DNA of his house. It was about restoring the very thing that had been corrupted, defiled, made unclean since the fall, preparing this house so that this will be ready for the coming of the king. It's interesting because when you begin to look at this word, the English word chromosomes, it comes from a Greek word chromo, which is actually from a Hebrew word karam, and it means a covering, to spread over, to lay something over. We understand that Passover, the blood's being spread over, it's being applied, you're being given this covering. But the interesting thing is that it's not only pointing back to what the Messiah did, but it's pointing forward as well. There's a covering that's going to come upon the house. This karam, this covering is spoken of in Ezekiel chapter 37. It says, I will lay sinews upon you and will bring up flesh upon you and cover, karam you with skin and put breath in you and you shall live and you shall know that I am Yahweh. Passover is dealing with the restoration of the house. We find that his word begins to go forth, and he's reminding us that as this word goes forth, it has the power to change your very DNA. It has the power to change who you are, to bring life to these dry bones, and to raise you up again, a covering that's being given. The amazing thing is that when we look at this festival of Passover, we understand that Yeshua was the Word made flesh, wasn't he? The grave couldn't hold him, could it? We find that there was no leaven in him, and so he's not kept in bondage. He's not kept by death. He's resurrected on the third day. And we find that not only does his resurrection guarantee he can have life, but he sets the precedent. He becomes the example because he's going to do the same thing with you and I. In Hosea verse 1, he tells us, "Come and let us return unto Yahweh, for he hath torn and he will heal us. He hath smitten and he will bind us up. 2 days will he revive us." We're in the throes of being revived. We've been asleep a long time. And we find that he's beginning to wake us up to revive us. He then goes on to say that in the third day, he will raise us up and we shall live in his sight. Yeshua was raised up on the third day, and he that if we'll get the leaven out, if we'll become a vessel that'll bring him in, put the word in, just like he was the word made flesh, then on the third day, just like he was raised up, so can we. The valley of dry bones can and will live again. We're going to get ready to close, and we're going to close with Psalms chapter 105, verse 37. This statement is made concerning the children of Israel when they came out of Egypt. It says, "He brought them forth also with silver and gold, and there was not one feeble person among their tribes." They removed the leaven in, and because of that, we find that when they leave, they're healed, they're delivered, they're redeemed. The valley of dry bones that had been laying in Egypt was resurrected and walked into the promised land. And that's exactly what he has planned for you and I. Can you say amen? Amen.